Hey everyone, Befron here, and welcome back to another episode. For today's video, we'll be talking about my favorite picks from Innistrad Midnight Hunt. Stick around to find out what those are, and let me know what your lists are down below in the comments. See you soon. Alright, so as mentioned, we'll be talking about my favorite picks from Innistrad Midnight Hunt. As a quick disclaimer, of course, all of my picks, all of anyone's picks will be biased by the types and styles and decks that they play in Magic the Gathering. So I'll give you some context about what those deck types are before I give you my list so you'll know why I'm picking the cards I'm picking. Also, as a second disclaimer, don't forget to check out BefronTCG.com for great prices on Yu-Gi-Oh! Magic the Gathering and Pokemon products. And if you like what you're seeing today, please don't forget to like and subscribe to the video to get more videos like this in the future. So the main types of decks that I'll be talking about for these cards today are standard decks. I have a blue-green ramp control deck, a red-blue control burn deck, as well as I just play commander on the side where that's sort of anything that fits, anything that's fun. So that's where all the cards I'll be talking about today sort of fit into. We'll start out with the blue-green standard ramp control deck to start with, and probably the card that I've seen a lot on that one is Primal Adversary. Now, Primal Adversary is a 3-drop 4/3 wolf with trample, which is pretty good to start out with, but it has this nice effect that works very well with ramp that when you play it, you can drop an extra 2 any number of times, and for every 2 that you drop, you can pump it by +1/+1 and turn a land into a 3/3 wolf, which is a really nice way to increase your board presence very quickly with a lot of creatures that can just attack out of the gate. So that's really good. It's a good way to take advantage of all the lands that you'll have in play to put out a lot of creatures all of a sudden and potentially have that as a win condition. The next card that I actually really like but I haven't seen on many deck lists yet is Lear, Disciple of the Drowned. Now this is a really cool card. For only 5 mana, it gives everything in your discard pile flashback, which is a very cool thing to do in ramp decks. I play Emergent Sequence, which is a card that brings out a land and makes it a creature that has power and toughness equal to the number of lands you have in play. So by the time you get out Lear and you probably have 5 or 6 lands, you could then play Emergent Sequence again from your discard pile and have a creature with maybe 6 or 7 or 8 toughness coming out as a land right from your deck, and it's a really powerful card to be able to play for only 2-drop. You could of course play a lot of other spells. This Lear also probably would fit in sort of a blue-red burn deck with a lot of instants and sorceries where you're using those to do damage to your opponent or their creatures. So a really cool card. Now it does have this first effect, spells cannot be countered. And that might seem pretty good because, again, you'll be casting all these spells from your discard pile and you don't want your opponent to suddenly counter all of them. However, I think this effect is actually more of a nerf to Lear because if you already had a lot of great counters in your discard pile from earlier in the game, like Saw It Coming or Dissipate, you'd be able to play all of those again. I think the countering ability could get too strong if Lear didn't disallow countering. So interesting card. I think there's a lot of potential for it in this kind of ramp deck. The last card that I've really seen becoming a staple in sort of blue-green ramp control decks is Wrenn 7. So this is a card that really plays into the ramp side of the deck. It lets you look at the top 4 cards of your deck, put any lands into play, and then put any other cards into the discard pile. And then for its kind of ultimate ability, it takes everything from your discard pile and puts it back into your hand. So you get all those cards that were discarded back into your hand. Now, I see this on a lot of lists, and I can see why it's good, but it seems a little slow. Now, I think at this point in the game, when you're able to play a 5-drop Planeswalker, you probably want something that's a little faster. This is really going to take about 3 turns to power it up to its 8 loyalty so that you can use its ultimate effect. And then at that time, you're just, even with that power-up effect, you're just playing more lands. You're not really putting anything else on the battlefield that's not going to threaten your opponent. So you got to already have 5 lands to play Wrenn 7. It's going to take you 3 turns so that you can use its ultimate anyway. It just seems really slow, and if you're at the point where you can play a 5-drop, let it sit on the field for 3 turns safely without getting attacked, it seems like you're already in a winning position anyway, so I don't really see how this card in and of itself would be a win condition or would really speed up the game a lot in your favor. But it is something I see on a lot of deck lists. I haven't tried it out myself yet, so I'm probably going to experiment with it a few times and see how it does. Now for some other cards that I think are interesting, but I have not seen as much on deck lists. One interesting card I think is Storm the Festival. This actually reminds me a lot of a card from Strixhaven called Ecological Appreciation. It's kind of a similar feel, but Ecological Appreciation let you search your entire deck or graveyard for any card less than X, which you could pay along with its mandatory 3-drop. This card, though, got a little expensive. If you wanted to be able to have access to 5 or 6 or 7 drop creatures, you'd really have to start paying up a lot of mana to do that. Whereas Storm the Festival is a lot cheaper. However, it only lets you look at the top few cards of your deck and only lets you play creatures with 5 or less mana. However, it does let you choose which those creatures are. In the case of Ecological Appreciation, you would have to let your opponent choose from the creatures that you want to put onto the battlefield. So, interesting trade-off between those two. I don't think any of these are going to be game changers, but I think that's interesting the way they always put parallels to previous cards in new sets. Another 2 cards that I like as part of just the control, I'm going to kind of go over them both at the same time. We have Sludge Monster, which is a 5-drop, which when it attacks or enters the battlefield, you can turn one of your opponent's creatures into a 2/2 sludge with no abilities, so you kind of nerf any of those cards. I like cards like this that really help you to deal with indestructible creatures, and then you can go ahead and destroy it, do any kind of board wipe or removal that you want to those creatures. And then Grafted Identity, if you can afford to sacrifice a creature, it's a great way to steal your opponent's indestructible creatures. Again, this is a way that I like to always have something in the deck that can deal with indestructible or things like that. That can handle those kind of creatures. So let me know what you think of those. That's my list for my blue-green ramp deck. Now we'll move on to my red-blue burn and control deck. So the first card I think that's most important for a deck like this that's going to play a lot of instants and sorceries is Consider. Now I think this is a really interesting card. Of course, we've always had Opt, which just got rotated out of Standard. Consider is a really good card because instead of just letting you scry one, it lets you put that card into your discard pile instead of on the top of your deck. Now, having cards in your discard pile is always better. It gets a lot better in these types of blue-red ramp decks where cards are dependent on the number of instants and sorceries that are in your discard pile. So it's a really good card, and I think it's a lot better than Opt, while being a nice, cheap spell that you can play early on in the game. For the next one is Smoldering Egg. Now this one is not a surprise. It's on a lot of your blue-red ramp deck lists already. It's a nice 0/4 defender for only 2-drop, and after you play instants and sorceries that total mana value of 7 or greater, it turns into this great flying dragon where every time you play an instant or sorcery, it deals 2 damage to any target, and it's a 4/4 flyer, which is a really solid card. So all around, Smoldering Egg seems like a no-brainer to put in a deck with a lot of instants and sorceries. Again, great defender to start out for only 2, and then it turns into this great dragon that really ramps up the damage you're going to be doing to your opponent very quickly. Another interesting card that I'm definitely going to try out a few times is Geist Flame Reservoir. Another great card. Every time you play an instant or sorcery, you put a counter on it, and then at any time you can drop 3 and tap the Geist Flame Reservoir and do the number of counters damage to a target, which is really good. So you charge that up for a few turns, and you're probably going to be doing 5 or 6 damage directly to any target within a turn or 2. And it's really good. I think it's a pretty promising card, so I'm excited to play with that a few times and see how it does in that deck. The next 2 cards are similar to ones we've seen in the past. The first is Arcane Infusion, which is very similar to Expressive Iteration. Expressive Iteration, of course, lets you look at the top 3 cards, put 1 into your hand, 1 into discard, and 1 into exile, letting you play the exiled card until the end of the turn. Arcane Infusion lets you look at top 4 and put 1 into your hand, but it also has flashback, so you can play it later in the game. Of course, there's a lot of cards in these types of deck that put cards into your discard pile, so you could just throw this card into your graveyard, wait a few turns, and then play it for its flashback cost, no problem. The next card is Galvanic Iteration, which is a nice dual strike. Again, it's just for blue and red, but it does, again, have flashback, which is really nice. So you could double, perhaps even a wing condition type spell that might do 5 or 6 damage to your opponent. You double it up with Galvanic Iteration, and that is a win condition for you. A few other interesting cards for red decks that I think are interesting, but probably won't go right into my deck right away. Curse of the Shaken. I think this might actually lean more towards Commander, where you just want an interesting way to burn your opponents after their first spell, every time they play a spell, they take 2 damage. So it's a nice way to constantly do a little bit of damage, ping away at an opponent, and reduce their ability to play too many spells in a turn. The next 2 I think are interesting. Maybe I would call them poor man's Goldspan Dragon. So I myself only have 1 Goldspan Dragon. A lot of the blue-red decks require 3 to be really competitive, and of course that gets very expensive very quickly. So these next 2 cards might be interesting ways to replace Goldspan. The first one of those is Bloodthirsty Adversary. This is a 2-drop, 2/2 creature with haste, so a nice way to do some quick damage to your opponent. However, it also lets you pay an extra 3 as many times as you'd like when it enters the battlefield, and you get +1/+1 on Bloodthirsty Adversary, and you can exile that many cards from the top of your library, and you can play them as long as they remain exiled for free, as long as they are 3-drop or less. So that really lets you cheat some nice cheap spells onto the field very quickly, just as you would with Goldspan after saving up a few treasure tokens. So really a nice way to get some of those spells on the field. You still get some of the benefits of having a haste creature, and it could get pretty strong if you can afford to pay for it a few times when it enters the battlefield. The other creature is Storm Skrillex. This is a very similar feel where it's a 5-drop flying dragon for 2/4, and all of your instants or sorceries cost 1 less to play, so you still get that nice economy effect. It's not a treasure token that you can truly use on anything, but all of your spells get cheaper. So if you could get 2 of these on the battlefield, you could really get some very, very, very cheap spells coming out in the future, which is a really nice thing to have. And again, it gives you that economy that you get from Goldspan Dragon and all the treasures it gives you. So that about wraps it up for all of my standard picks for my blue-green ramp control deck and my red-blue ramp burn deck. Let's move on to Commander. So the first interesting card is Rem Karulus. I think this is a really cool commander to build around. It lets you put a lot of those win condition type spells like Earthquake that we've seen in the past. Basically, it prevents all damage that spells do to you while adding 1 to all damage that spells do to your opponent. It's also a nice, cheap commander for only a 3-drop. And yeah, I think there's going to be a lot of decks that you can build around this. There is Gisela, which is a card that's in the past that kind of has a similar feel. It doubles all damage to your opponents, but it only halves damage that sources do to you. However, Gisela does work for all sources, not just spells. So a little bit of different feel, but I think Rem Karulus has a lot more potential because it's so much cheaper. It's only a 3-drop versus Gisela, which is a 7-drop. So it makes it a lot harder to cast. The next one that I'm really excited about that I think is going to be a lot of fun is Gisela Glorious Resurrector. This is a really fun looking card. Basically, every time one of your opponent's creatures dies, it comes back under your control, which I just think has a lot of capacity to be a really fun card to play, constantly killing your opponent's creatures and then resurrecting them under your control and using those to defeat all of your opponents. And it's not too expensive to get out on the field, and of course black has a lot of removal and board wipe, so it should be a pretty easy thing to, once you get Gisela out, to kill a lot of your opponent's creatures and take them under your control. And then my last one for Commander is Triskaidekaphile. I'm currently working on a deck with all of these janky win conditions, from Phage the Untouchable to Triskaidekaphobia. This Triskaidekaphile will be a nice little addition to that, where I can add another janky win condition to my Commander deck and hopefully splash out some weird edge cases that my opponents have to be careful of during a game. That's my review for Commander. I have 3 last cards that I want to go over as sort of an honorable mention. First is Infernal Grasp, which is another nice little cheap piece of removal. Just another good piece to have, especially if you are playing Gisela, like I said before, and you want to easily kill some of your opponent's creatures. And finally, the card we're all excited to see, of course, is Teferi, who slows the sunset. Of course, Teferi is always going to be a very powerful card. In this case, is no exception. It gives you the +1 ability to tap your opponent's permanents and or untap your own, which is always good. Gives you a lot more access to your abilities and lands. And then for its ultimate ability, it leaves you with an emblem that lets you draw during your opponent's draw steps and untap your own permanents during your opponent's untap steps. So you'll have plenty of blockers and abilities to activate during all their steps. I know this is a blue-white, but I might actually try to play this in my blue-green ramp deck with splashing out some white via treasure tokens or something like that. I think it's a nice, fun, exciting, surprising thing to put in there that might be able to pull off really nicely. And the last card I want to talk about is Celestis. Now, I don't really think Night and Day as a mechanic is really going to take off all that much. It's probably going to go down in history as just another little flavor mechanic that was a part of Innistrad series. However, I think this is a nice little mono rock that lets you take advantage of an opponent who might need the Night and Day. You can disrupt them with its ability to turn day into night or night into day, and then benefit from that change by gaining you some life and giving you a little cycle action. So a nice little card you can put in, and I think, again, it's a nice little monosync in case you want that draw or life gain. So anyway, that's my list. I covered all different formats from Standard, Commander, and even a couple honorable mentions. Let me know what you think of that in the comments down below, and if you like what you see, please don't forget to like and subscribe, and check out BefronTCG.com for some gaming products, and I'll see you all next time.